Our next and final speaker for this morning is Alessio Agostini. He is associate professor in the Department of the Study of Antiquity at Sapienza. His interests include comparative Semitics, and he has worked on expiation rituals and languages of pre-Islamic Arabia. His presentation today will be on motion and posture in ancient South Arabian ritual setting and related ceremonies.
Much. And of course, my first thanks are for Paola Mollo for this kind invitation and to the Institute for hosting us today with this very interesting meeting. Okay, so with more than 10,000 inscriptions, the ancient South Arabian documentation from the southwestern Arabian Peninsula is one of the richest of the Semitic epigraphic corpora written in linear script. However, because a limited part of the underlying background can be seen in somewhat stereotyped epigraphic evidence, many parts of the South Arabian ideology remain rarely recognized, even though newly added material written in cursive script has shed light on this civilization everyday activities. This is especially true in the case of religious thought, also because mythological and literary narratives are still lacking, both of which must have existed. Regarding today's topic, I would like to focus on movement and posture within the South Arabian ritual context. Indeed, there are still open questions on this subject that could be analyzed from both an internal and a comparative perspective. In the analysis that follows, I will focus on a particular kind of processional movement and consider whether it might be a more specific act of circumambulation rather than a general procession. I will then conclude by looking at how seating was controlled in the ritual setting. To highlight the primary interpretative issues, I will select some textual examples while also reviewing the critical points from the previous debate. As a premise, it is important to keep in mind that one of the potential threats when studying lexical material that is directly related to the ritual dimension, namely the symbolic meaning of the relative vocabulary. It is in fact not always easy to find an unambiguous correspondence between a physical state one would like to identify and the ancient terminology. This may also be due to an overlap between an allusive, even symbolic level and the tangible one. The many readings of the text are still influenced by this circumstance, especially in the South Arabian field. Furthermore, the way that some epigraphic texts are seldom interpreted has further contributed to emphasize the conventional and formulaic nature of this documentation, so that when faced with ambiguous occurrences, there is a natural tendency to favor a generic translation that may be technically correct, but which avoids assigning a more specific meanings that would also be plausible, although controversial, with the result of further flattening the original material. Archaeological data can sometimes also offer useful elements for discussion, especially considering that ancient monuments in this region are often very well preserved and, despite the diversity of opinions they may inspire, can sometimes suggest something more about the rituals that took place there in ancient times. One of the most common religious practices in ancient South Arabia was pilgrimage, and we know of numerous significant shrines that served as the destination for periodic pilgrimages. The most well-known was the pilgrimage to the Awam temple dedicated to god Al-Maka in the Sabian capital Marib, which took place during the month Duhabhi, roughly February-March, and which was also used by non-Sabian people. Another important destination was the temple of Al-Maka in Sirwah, as well as the temple of god Talab at Jabal Riyam in the northern highlands. Smaller shrines were used as more localized pilgrimage destinations, like the one at Yathil in the Minan kingdom. The rite of pilgrimage is usually defined by words such as Hadar and Haufar, both referring to a religious feast. From the 2nd century onwards, the term hajj also became prevalent, which is also found in Hebrew and corresponds to Arabic hajj. Some terms, like haf, which is also only found in the southern highlands, appear to be limited to specific dialectal regions. I now want to concentrate on a lexical root, haya, that appears to represent a particular activity within the pilgrimage rite that has been interpreted in a variety of ways over time due to the root's complex semantic range. This root doesn't seem to have any cognates outside South Semitic and Arabic, suggesting that it is exclusive to the Arabian Peninsula. Its basic meaning appears to be to flow, to run. The derived terminology was given a variety of semantic nuances, some of which were even quite different from one another. Examples of these include the causative to pour a liquid, to offer a libation, as well as nominal constructions related to building structures, at least an extent or stretch of a monument or some kind of roads. All these meanings can be acceptable according to the documentation in which the root is employed, also outside the ritual context. However, there are also many situations in which it is not always possible to choose between these semantic nuances, or even identify a more specific one due to a laconic style of text or their fragmentary conditions. One of these texts, which is thought to be from the 1st century AD, was discovered in a Marib storehouse. However, it was most likely from Sirwah, the significant religious site located 40 kilometers west of Marib, and the location of the other significant temple of Al-Makah. We present here the translation by Norbert Nebes, who published the inscription a few years ago. Here, the verb haya governs a temporal phrase that has the city of Sirwah as indirect complement with preposition ad, to go. Nebes interpreted this as he performed a ritual procession to Sirwah, considering the possibility that this procession occurred between several centuries, in this case from Marib to Sirwah. The Zabaische Wörterbuch, in contrast, favors the generic translation to go, which is formally correct, but prevents the chance of understanding a significant semantic specialization, particularly when it is employed in a clear religious context, like this one. There is another inscription from Sirwah, but it is much earlier, from the 8th, 7th century BC, which is partly still in its original archaeological context, on the external wall of the temple of Al-Makah. The prior renderings of the sentence, including the term haya, reveal all the ambiguities around its interpretation. In this case, the number 3 implies the possibility of repeating the action haya several times. Walter Müller intended it as he executed the construction of the sanctuary for the 3rd time, considering the possible reference to the construction of the 3rd temple to Al-Makah promoted by the sovereign subject of the inscription. But this interpretation is not entirely convincing. The Zabaische Wörterbuch repeats the very generic rendering he went 3 times, while Nebes prefers he made a ritual procession for the 3rd time, which is consistent with the interpretation of the previous text. Mahmoud al-Ghul, on the other hand, precisely for this inscription, suggested back in 1993 that the action expressed by the verb haya could be even more precisely defined as, I quote, either an act of circumambulation around the sanctuary or an act of walking or running between 2 landmarks, like the hurried walking between Al-Safa and Marwa, 2 rocks as the names indicate in the Meccan pilgrimage. We might have here a very stimulating suggestion, which could recall a well-known practice in some Eastern religions and one important part of Islamic Hajj. In fact, although it is highly probable that ritual circumambulation was also known in pre-Islamic South Arabia, it is still unclear which terminology was used to define it. Certainly, there are no attestations of terms like tawaf or hakkafa, which denotes circumambulation in Arabic and Hebrew, at least Talmudic Hebrew, respectively. The root haya is also sometimes constructed with its internal object, the noun mahaya. We are lucky enough to see the use of this substantive in a well-known figurative panel that depicts what appears to be a ritual procession. It is believed that the panel was originally from Marib region. In this instance, it may have had a pretty gory premise if we look at the participants, a group of archers parading with their trophy, the cut hands of their enemies, most likely in celebration of a victorious return from a battle. However, the verbal term mahaya is also used in other contexts where it is obviously related to architecture and suggests building operations. Two inscriptions from the Wawam temple in Marib are interesting at this regard. Translating into general terminology like construction make a perfect sense in these situations. But given the preceding analysis and the fact that these occurrences are directly linked to the Awam temple in Marib's oval enclosure, we question whether a more precise interpretation should be given in this instance, perhaps designating the pilgrimage site itself as one place meant for circumambulation, which also reflects the peculiar shape of this sanctuary. Some of the most significant documents of the South Arabian religion come from the sanctuary of Jar al-Labba, where we find a somewhat different nominal derivation of the root Haya. When in 1872 Joseph Halevi rediscovered this text in the Jowf Valley of northern Yemen, he provided a very brief account of the inscribed pillars enclosing this very ancient sacred area used since the 8th century BC. Unfortunately, neither the sanctuary nor the related inscriptions were ever discovered again, so we lack any information about the archaeological setting of these impuzzling texts, and the reading of which are still unverifiable. In one of these texts, we find the use of the nominal derivation Hayyum in connection with Sadaim, both in the indeterminate state, where the latter could also be an adjective. The majority of current interpretation of this challenging passage adhere to Alfred Biston's 1949 first study, in which he suggested that the root Haya means to offer. However, he eventually became open to Gould's interpretation, attributing the meaning to run to Hayyam, and the meaning to slow pace in circumambulation to the term Sadaim, primarily based on the Arabic sada, which means stretch the lengths in running. However, Arabic sadia, be moist, is another good lexical comparison and a compelling argument that could also sustain for this occurrence of Hayyum the meaning to flow a libation offering, which is in fact also retained in some of the current translations. Eventually, there remains a degree of ambiguity between these two semantic levels, one evoking liquid libations and the other a type of ritual movement. One may wonder if this overlapping might have been intentional. It appears reasonable to resolve that in some texts the term Haya denotes a specific kind of ritual movement which surely represented an important part of the procession, and it might have also identified a specific type of circumambulation, an activity that could also be consistent with the semantic base of the root, as well as the archaeological setting to which these texts are related. Furthermore, it is plausible that circumambulation is also occasionally associated with ceremonies involving the invocation of rain or dew. This might have contributed to the approximation of the two semantic levels that we have just seen to be quite recurrent in this text, and which could also lead us to think that this polysemy might have also been intrinsic. Now we move to the other root. The final section of this analysis will focus on terms used to designate sitting or resting position during religious rites. This is conveyed by the general root wathaba, the counterpart of the Hebrew root yashav that was the object of the interesting paper given yesterday by our convener Paolo Mollo. It goes without saying that in South Arabian we find the etymological root, thus with the first vav which in Northwest Semitic has become yod in this position, and with the retention of the medial interdental, which in Canaanite has become a sibilant, of course. The basic meaning of the root wathab is to sit, like in Hebrew, which has led to the creation of a wide range of terms that are loosely related and convey meanings like to reside, to dwell, to stay. The nominal results can also refer to a more specific part of a residence, like a reception hall, or a generic building intended as the seat of an authority, thus also temples, as well as furniture, like thrones or seats. Just like with Haya, there are situations where it isn't always easy to determine the more appropriate meaning. Sitting within the community is a very important condition during religious celebration, as this brief text engraved on one pillar of another temple of Al-Makah in Marib, the Arsh Bilqis, also shows. Should he present to the god a thigh and a shoulder, the expiatory offering, and may the priest take his place, so sit, with the community. The chance to sit with the community is undoubtedly a significant occasion, but it also necessitates adherence to certain standards, particularly regarding the complex purity code. According to this penitential text from Marib Zawam, sitting in the community while unclean may result in offense. When they did not refrain from sitting in the sanctuary while him, Agarum, which is mentioned before, stank of smelly herbs and onion. Unfortunately, the text eventually discloses that this Mr. Agarum suffered an infectious disease that lasted for 6 months as a result of this infection. The verbal noun mauthab is also found in South Arabia and may be directly observed in certain Minaic texts. It refers to the seats that the individuals permitted to enter the temple could sit on. The word is engraved on one of the benches that originate from the temple devoted to the god Nakrach in Barakish, ancient Minean Yathil. This long monolith was originally inside the postile hall and moved at the exterior already in ancient times following a rearrangement of the interior layout of the temple. It reads, Biathar, son of Lahia That du Sailum, member of the congregation of Athar du Yahrik, dedicated to Athar du Kabdum, the seat of the congregation, and banned in the whole seat sexual relations. It is evident that this text restates the normative premises about ceremonial purity that we saw in the preceding Sabaic text, which punished the violation of these norms. We also see the use of the same term muthab, to indicate the bench as well as the entire building, as the god's seat. This image displays the additional benches that have been maintained inside the hall. These seats were used by a select group of worshippers who belonged to the clergy or congregation and were seated around the offertory cenacles that are distinctive to this hypostyle temple. Even though the terminology derived from the root wathab appears to develop a more uniform semantic spectrum within South Arabian, there are still instances where it is difficult to distinguish between a specific reference to a physical posture and the secondary semantic development. This is the main issue to be considered here as well. And it is precisely in relation to the root wathab that one cannot resist mentioning the notorious anecdote found in several Islamic authors, like, for example, Ali Himyari, which highlights the pitfalls that exist even when comparing between Kognite languages. In this case, the problem was between the Himyarite language, a late development of South Arabian, and the Arabic dialects of the peninsula. The story revolves around a northern Arab who traveled to Zafar, the capital of the Himyar Empire. The king greeted him properly and used the polite expression Thebe to invite him to sit down, which is the imperative from Wathaba. Unexpectedly, the guest leaped out of the window, as in Arabic, wathaba means exactly the opposite movement, to jump. A regrettable misunderstanding for the confused yet polite guest at the court of Himyar, for us a good admonition when dealing with comparative lexical studies. Thank you very much.